Welcome to Series 2 of the Whose Power podcast from members of the Preservative Party together with me, Abigail Harrison-Moore. Based at Leeds City Museum, the Preservative Party is a group of young curators who break down traditional barriers and influence the way exhibitions and events are curated and presented. And I'm a professor at Leeds University who's been learning with the Preservative Party about how we research together, exploring participatory action research methods. When we recorded and listened to our first series of Whose Power, we realised that podcasting brought something special to our collaborative research. It was both a method and allowed us to tell others about what we've been doing together. So in the second series of Whose Power, we dig deeper into the way participatory research changes the lives of young people and explore how podcasting helps us to do this. We're talking about how we create and maintain safe spaces for real collaboration and how we amplify the voices of those least listened to.
Even if young people are asked what they think of something, even that can make a difference.
In actually taking action and responding to what they're saying.
By listening really carefully to them. In episode 3, we're discussing the power of participation. Rahisa and Tay are joined by Izzy Bartley. Izzy is using participatory research methods to explore decolonising museums through playing board games. And I'll be reflecting on their conversation and what I think it means for researchers like me who are interested in the power of participatory research.
Thank you, Abigail. Welcome, Izzy, to our podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
First question, what does participatory action research, or PAR, mean to you?
I think there's lots of different kinds of participatory action research. So I think many times the idea is that the project is designed from the ground up with the participants, which is not what happened with my research project. So I conceived my PhD project myself, but then what happened is that it morphed over time as I had participation from some of my museum colleagues and from some other people who came to be part of my research project. So once the project had already started, and shifting perhaps the focus of the project through that rather than sitting down together at the beginning and deciding what the project might be.
Could you tell us a little bit about your research?
Yeah, so I've had a bit of a kind of a journey really to get to where I am now. So I used to be a classroom teacher. I specialised in secondary education, teaching citizenship. I found the classroom environment quite difficult. I think I admire any teachers who stick it out. After about 12 years of different kinds of teaching, both in the UK and abroad, I moved into museums. So I came to work for Leeds Museums and Galleries as the digital learning officer. And in that role, I was involved with creating learning resources to go online for teachers to use in the classrooms. I did an audit of all the content and realised that what we were providing for teachers was the very white male Victorian kind of curriculum that we've been teaching over and over and which I was taught. And so kind of went on a bit of a mission to try and diversify that and to bring in many different voices and many different points of view. And a lot of that was about empire and decolonising. So I got really interested into that, learning lots because I had to learn it because I hadn't been taught it, which I got quite angry about. And at the same time, I was rediscovering my love of board games. So I grew up playing board games and card games with my grandparents and parents. Hours of Monopoly with my brother and sister, because I realise now my brother was cheating. Yeah. He's 6 years older than me, so I didn't know at the time. And then I was playing all these games and I was like, well, where are the women in these games? And all the games, not all of them, but many of them had very white male characters and many of them had very colonial themes, whether they were in-your-face colonial, like the game called Colonialism, or perhaps slightly more hidden. And so I kind of wanted to put those two things together and think about how can we use these games, which are commercially available, which people are buying. You can get them off online. You can go into Waterstones and buy quite a few. You can go into specialist game shops and buy some. And these are, objects of cultural media and people absorb stuff from these games. So what are they absorbing and then how can we use these games really? How can we kind of turn them around and use them as a tool to help think about ways to explore decolonising. Specifically, it became in museums as I worked more with my colleagues.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like today is going to be a learning experience as much for us as like the actual listeners of this episode. I think it's really cool that this is like the focus, I guess, of your research because no one would really think of analysing, I guess, board games in this sort of context and like actually seeing how it can have an effect on like what people think and believe and stuff like that.
I love how you said absorb, like these board games, and they're not just board games, this culture that you're absorbing, people don't understand. Well, a lot of people, they do consume culture every single day, but they do it in a very passive way. Board games, film, TV, music, these are the things that really make up our life. And like when you see a specific representation that's really colonial, that's really imperial, it sticks with you, especially when you're a person of colour, especially when you're a woman, especially when you're LGBT. And to try and use those board games and have a conversation, a very open and like an honest conversation about that is just really cool. I just wanted to mention that. It was brilliant.
Thanks. Well, I found it really interesting because we've had a lot of talk about, like you just said, books and films, and yet board games have been really overlooked, particularly in academia. They've been really overlooked. So video games they're flashy and all singing, all dancing, and they've really overtaken board games in terms of being studied. And it's such a shame. Of course, board games are better. But there's, board games have been around for thousands and thousands of years. So it's really important, I think, that we start to look more critically at them.
When I was younger, I just wanted to mention this like a really tiny anecdote, but when I was younger, I used to get called like a killjoy a lot because I used to point out how when I used to play Monopoly with my siblings, that it was like peak capitalism. Yeah. And like everyone hated me for it. Like, it's just a game. Why can't you just why are you overthinking it so much? But I don't know, I just wanted to mention that.
Well, see, that's really interesting you said that because when you had that pushback of it's just a game, that's exactly what not a lot, but you do get that from the board game community when you push back against things. So, for example, lack of representation or colonial imperial overtones. But it's just a game, we're just playing. That was what you tend to get pushed back onto people who do kind of stand up and say, oh, actually, we need to improve these kind of things. Yeah. So it's interesting that you had that as well. Yeah.
Thanks for telling us about your research. Very interesting stuff. Why did you specifically choose to use participatory and action research methods for your research?
Two reasons for this in a way. One is that board games are generally quite social, so you need other people to play them. Now, you can play solo, and I do play solo board games, but one of the major reasons that is cited for people playing board games is to play with your friends or to play with other people. So that's social. And then I think that if we want to decolonise museums and do decolonising work, we need to do it with other people. So I think that there is a lot of work you need to do yourself, perhaps before you start working with other people, perhaps. But then, you need to get people on the same page to move forward. And people bring in different ideas and different skills and different experiences. I am a white person, right? So that I'm going to have certain experiences. I'm going to be missing certain experiences. I'm going to have certain biases and unconscious biases. And I need to have other people around me to help me, but also to learn from and to learn from each other. So I think doing it in a participatory way is really kind of the only way to do it.
Yeah, I agree. It's good to have a bunch of different types of people's opinions in this stuff whenever you're doing like research. It's good to have other opinions, other insights, other points of views because, people go through and experience life differently.
No, I agree completely. I think also participatory action research, specifically because you get, like you said, you learn and you get help from other people. I don't know how to word this, but I feel like a lot of academics think that if they get help from other people, that it somehow undermines their authority. I've always thought learning and education is should be communal. So it should be something that not only you learn from, but also impart. So you learn from each other. Yeah, I'm just on board with that. What methods are you using?
So I'm very, very lucky that I work with fabulous colleagues at Leeds Museums and Galleries. And they've been very encouraging and very helpful with my research. So I've been able to recruit them as my participants. And that was really important to me because as my research focus shifted, so it started off looking at colonialism in board games, mostly as like material culture. But then as I sat down and played these games with a couple of colleagues, I realised that they were bringing expertise to the table that I didn't have. So curatorial expertise especially, and life experience expertise. that actually using the game to explore museum practice, past and present, and museums are steeped in colonialism, was actually a really rich way to start these conversations, which can be quite difficult. So if we just sit down around a table with people and go, let's talk about colonialism, I think it's quite difficult to do that, and it's quite kind of in your face. But when you're playing a board game which has all these links to colonialism, it's much easier to talk through the board game. And then as my methodology changed or developed, it became easier to link that play that was happening through the board game to actually Leeds Museums and Galleries collection and past collection practices, and then onto what kind of decolonising work that we can do. And just the conversations that we're having are also, I think, decolonising work. What I did was, at the first iteration, I got 2 colleagues, so the curator of natural science and a community curator, and we sat down and played a game called Papua, which was released in 2018. The reason I mention the date is because the design is that you are a scientific explorer and you're going to Papua New Guinea and you're collecting specimens for prestige. And you're bidding on these specimens. So you put in bids behind a little screen so the other players can't see what you're bidding on. Right. And the cards that you're bidding on are things like there's a beetle, there's a snake, there's a butterfly, there's a bird, and there's also an indigenous person. And you bid on them in exactly the same way. And the fact that this came out, so recently is really quite worrying. And so that game really opened up, it did quite a lot of things, but it helped me shift my methodology to, we can use these games to discuss really difficult subjects. But also, it was the only time I used that game. I didn't use it in the future because it was the potential for trauma was too much in a way.
Yeah.
But what it did do was lead to the creation of a code of respect that I asked participants to read through and sign about how we're going to speak to each other and what we might be talking about. So everybody was aware of that before. And it led to more of a realization for me. It was kind of a bit of a, I've put this methodology around play because I believe that play is the agency of players taking those actions is powerful rather than just looking at the game as material culture. Games are made to be played. I believe you can't fully understand a game until you've played it. And so when I read the rule book of Papua and I read, okay, this is how you collect the cards. Okay, one of these is an indigenous person. This is problematic, but this will be an interesting, shall we say, talking point. But it wasn't until we actually played the game and all of us were sat around going, well, none of us would bid on the indigenous person. It was that difference between reading and understanding the rules to actually playing the game and what it feels like to make that action or to not make that action because none of us wanted to.
I feel concerning that a game that's came out so recently is still showing things like this and treating Indigenous people like this is kind of hurtful to know that that's still a thing today. But that's really interesting. I understand why you want to use play as a way because you can't, like you said, you can't understand things fully until you do it. As a way to sort of, document this, you use podcasting. Is there a specific reason that you decided to use podcasts?
Yeah, so I had a bit of a 2-stage process, really. So when we actually play the game, I audio recorded the play experience, which included the whole setup of the board game and talking through the rules and the discussions within that. And then I went away and listened to that audio. I did a bit of reflection on it, and then I managed to get those people back in to record a podcast episode. I found that really valuable because it enabled me to have a bit of a reflection space, and I think the participants as well, between playing the game and then coming back round the table to talk even more about it in the podcast. And I could create some show notes to kind of help guide the conversation, but it was also very open to what the participants wanted to bring. One of the games that we played was Ticket to Ride India. So Ticket to Ride is a very, very popular series of games, millions of copies sold. And there's lots of different versions of it. And one is India. And it's set in 1911 India under the British Raj. That's what it says on the back of the box. It also says that you're on your Grand Tour, which is completely historically inaccurate because the Grand Tour never went to India. But the game positions you as a white person. And if you're on the Grand Tour, chances are you're a white man. And so I played that game with the curator of industrial history at Leeds Museums and Galleries and a Indian professor. And it was absolutely fascinating, the conversations that happened during gameplay. And then actually we had new and more involved conversations during the podcast episode based on things I'd picked out that we talked about during the gameplay. For me as well, as a facilitator, I'm trying to facilitate the gameplay as well as the conversation, and it's something that's new to me. Then the participants are trying to learn the game and have the conversations. And so to actually come back again to have the podcast is a space where we can just sit and chat and go over things and ask more questions. And I think it was a really valuable way of doing it. And I've actually used both audio from the play experience and audio from the podcast episodes in my thesis write-up. There's going to be 3 episodes coming out, and it's called Acquisition Disorder, which reflects the acquisition of museum objects during colonial times, and also board gamers. We do have a habit of acquiring more games than we play.
Same thing with readers.
Yes.
We met you through Whose Power and you trained with us as podcasters. What did you learn through this process?
For me, one of the reasons why I really enjoy podcasting and taking that extra step from having played the game to then bringing the same people around the table to record the podcast is that we can share the stories in a more kind of equal way. Like I said, there's the difficulty with trying to facilitate the game and the conversation as the research facilitator. And for the participants, there's the challenge of learning the game and playing the game and doing the talking. And then when we come around the table to record the podcast, we bring that experience and all our life experiences together to the table. And all we're doing is having a conversation. It's a lot easier, I think, to have some more kind of in-depth conversations and to bring those kind of anecdotes in that are really important and to bring those voices in. So the podcast is going to be the public-facing part of my research. I think probably 4 people are going to read my thesis, maybe. And I felt this was really important to bring other people's voices to the board game industry. So the board game industry is very heavily male and it's very heavily white male. And I think that's reflected in the games that are produced. It's reflected in the artwork that's produced. And it's reflected in that kind of, it's just a game, we're only playing, why are you getting your knickers in a twist? Which is another comment I've seen on a chat. And so to actually play these games with people who are very underrepresented within the board game industry. So I played with the Indian professor, I played with a Somalian archaeologist, a game about archaeology. Those voices we don't hear coming through. So the podcast is a way to try and get those voices out a bit more and say, no, this does matter and we should be listening to people. This is not good enough. What's happening at the moment in the industry, I don't believe is good enough and we should be doing a lot more to try and make progress.
Yes, it's very interesting and it ties in really well with the work that we've been doing on the first and this season of the podcast. We spoke about the power of voice, and I think that you're really utilizing, a podcast in a way to sort of project people's voices who, otherwise wouldn't have been heard. And I think it sort of shows that podcasting in general can be a equally good, I guess, research method, as well as like doing journals or writing other things, because it lets people be heard and share their voice that otherwise no one would have heard properly in this sort of context. Like I said earlier, this is all like a learning experience for me too. So it's really nice to be sat here and like learning about how you use podcasting, how you use participatory research to like further your research and your work that you're doing. And also, I guess, just to teach people in the museum industry.
Have you had any feedback on your research methods?
In academia, I've had some interest in it, yes, in terms of board games are now starting to become more popular as cultural media and as objects of material culture, which is really exciting. Yes, I've got some articles coming out and going to present at a conference about using play. And as I said at the beginning, I have fabulous colleagues. Every curatorial staff at Leeds Museums and Galleries is involved in public-facing work, which is very unusual in museums. So the idea of sitting down and playing a game and learning through that, they were very open to that idea. And I'm very grateful to them for their time and to all my participants for their time, because I do understand that in spending, it was 2 to 2.5 hours a session with me, people are trusting that this play experience is going to be worthwhile, that it is going to be useful. And similarly, coming back for the podcast episode, same thing, you know, that it is going to hopefully make a difference or help make a difference or add to voices that aren't being heard at the moment.
What do you hope to change with your research?
I'm hoping that two aspects will come out of it. So one, I would like to further explore the method of playing board games as a way of continued professional development for museum professionals to think about decolonising and imperial legacies, because some of the conversations that we had out of those, I should stress that it's the museum professional with another member of the public, but somebody who has a cultural or experiential background to the game that we're playing has been really, really valuable. And that has involved an incredible amount of trust, building up a relationship prior to coming to the table and being completely transparent about the game that we're going to play and what's involved there, I think is really, really important. So there's the decolonising museum side. And then I do really hope that I can add to those voices who are working really hard in the board game industry, in the board game community, to say we need to think much more carefully about these games, about what's being produced, about the messages that we're sending when we are creating these games, because they are presented as fun, right? Games are fun, but it's not necessarily fun depending on who you are and where you're coming from and your experiences and your heritage. If you're seeing that reflected in a game that treats you and your people or your culture in a really disrespectful way. But that seems to be very much overlooked at the moment in the board game industry. So I really want to kind of bring those conversations to the fore.
I think both of our experiences working with museums, we've both been, like as the Preservative Party, and you were doing your research, exploring sort of the overlooked communities and people that are in museums, and, you know, their history, their culture is being used and sort of portrayed in exhibits and things like that, but we don't really know the history behind it. We don't really consult the people that it's about. And I think that it's great and really important for us to continue to do this work on, you know, empowering overlooked voices and sort of making it a more public thing for everyone to focus on, you know, these communities are being overlooked and that's wrong. We did the same work with Whose Power. Scene did the same work on the overlooked project with the Preservative Party. I think it's great that it's becoming more of a known thing now to care about these other voices. I think you're doing really well with that.
Well, thank you, because I know that you've, you know, worked really integrally to Leeds museums and galleries and to helping to bring that more diverse, these diverse views, and to bring those histories that have been hidden, as we like to call them, to the fore. And I think that's really, really vital work.
Thank you, Izzy, for coming on our podcast. We've learned so much from you today, and good luck with the rest of your research. It's time to hand it back to Abigail, who's going to give us her reflections on our conversation that we've just had.
Thanks ever so much to Tay, Rahisa and Izzy for sharing their thoughts and insights on the power of participation. So what have I learned from listening to their conversation? Well, one of the key points that Izzy made was we need to get people on the same page to move forward. How do we do that? Well, as we heard, it's about having open and honest conversations, helping other people learn, but also learning from each other, bringing different expertise to the table and not assuming in advance where that expertise lies. That's what we've been talking about all the way through Whose Power, bringing different people to the table to create new systems of power. But that does also require that we use respect. I was very struck by Izzy's conversation about the code of respect that she used when playing games, but also within the podcast studio, and being constantly aware as researchers working together of the potential risk, the potential trauma to other people, working with other people to understand them. Because often participatory research is driven brilliantly through either anger or through love. There is an emotional part of it. That's why also we heard about how participatory research evolves organically. We have to be prepared to change and shift to work with our learning with other people within the space, whether that space is playing games or that space is in the podcast studio. And in order to do that, we have to trust. We have to trust each other and we have to trust the process. Taking action is really powerful and it's worth the time, the emotional energy and the work to support each other, to trust each other and to respect each other so that we can move forward and we can make change. So in episode 4, we're turning our attention to the power of collaboration. And we're speaking with members of the Preservative Party who work with us on Whose Power to think together about how podcasts can be a space where participatory research can happen. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Whose Power podcast. Music is by Tay. Funding comes from the Research England Policy Support Fund, which the University of Leeds this year is using to support participatory research. If you've got a question or a comment about what you've heard in this episode, then you can find the Preservative Party on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. We'd really love to hear from you. This is a research podcast production.